The first time it happened, I dismissed it as the most vivid case of déjà vu I'd ever experienced. I woke up with the familiar blare of my alarm clock, the digital red numbers glowing 6:30 a.m. Outside my window, a flat, gray sky pressed down on the quiet suburban street. The kind of overcast morning that promises a slow, uninspired Tuesday. I went through the motions, showered, the water pressure a little weak as always, brewed a pot of coffee, the cheap brand tasting vaguely of burnt plastic, and grabbed my keys from the ceramic bowl by the door. The one my ex-girlfriend left behind. The date on my phone read Tuesday, June 4th. The day was unremarkable. Work was a slog of spreadsheets and hollow conference calls. Lunch was a sad desk salad. The drive home was choked with the usual traffic. I made dinner, watched some mindless television, and fell asleep on the couch around 11. The last thing I remember was the weatherman on the local news channel droning on about a potential thunderstorm that never seemed to arrive. Then, my alarm clock blared, 6:30 a.m. I slapped the snooze button, my arm heavy with sleep. My eyes cracked open. The same flat, gray sky, the same quiet street. I stumbled out of bed and into the bathroom, splashing water on my face. It was only when I was spooning coffee grounds into the filter that the first prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. This felt identical, not just similar, identical. I pulled out my phone. Tuesday, June 4th. I laughed it off. A glitch. Maybe I hadn't charged it properly. But the unease lingered, a low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. The day unfolded with a chilling precision. The same coworker, Brenda, would spill her latte at 9:15 a.m., letting out the same theatrical gasp. The fire drill at 2 p.m. would be a false alarm. Just like yesterday, the same red pickup truck would cut me off at the same intersection on the way home. That night, I forced myself to stay awake. I sat on my couch, every light in the house on, my eyes glued to the digital clock on the cable box. The local news was on again. The same weatherman, the same placid expression, the same empty promise of a storm. 11:55 p.m. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. 11:56 p.m. The house was unnervingly silent. The usual groans of the pipes were gone. The hum of the refrigerator was absent. 11:57 p.m. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, weighted down with lead, a wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over me. 11:58 p.m. I fought it, pinching my arms, standing up and pacing. My legs felt like jelly. My vision started to swim. 11:59 p.m. I was on my knees, crawling toward the kitchen for a glass of water. A sudden, blinding pain exploded in my chest. A white-hot spear of agony. I gasped, but no air came. My hands clawed at my throat. My vision tunneled into a pinpoint of light. The numbers on the cable box mocking me. Then, darkness. And then, the blare of my alarm clock. 6:30 a.m. I shot upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering. My chest felt fine, no pain. I looked at my phone. Tuesday, June 4th. It wasn't déjà vu. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The first week was a blur of frantic experimentation. I tried everything. I smashed my alarm clock, only to be woken by the phantom sound of its ringing. I threw my phone into the river, but it was back on my nightstand the next morning, fully charged. On the 7th loop, I packed a bag, got in my car at sunrise, and just drove. I drove for hours, pushing east, watching the identical gray sky scroll past. I made it 3 states over. I felt a flicker of hope, a desperate, fluttering thing. I checked into a grimy motel, paid in cash, and locked myself in the room, miles away from my home, from the epicenter of this nightmare. I watched the clock on the bedside table. 11:58 p.m. The room was stale with the smell of cigarettes and despair. 11:59 p.m. The single light bulb in the ceiling fixture flickered violently. It buzzed, a sound like a trapped insect growing louder and louder, until it was a deafening roar. Then, with a pop that sounded like a gunshot, the bulb exploded, showering the room in darkness. In that same instant, a shard of glass, impossibly sharp, impossibly fast, shot across the room and embedded itself in my neck. I fell, clutching the wound, the warm, Sticky wetness of my own blood, a shocking sensation on my hands. My last sight was the cheap, patterned carpet, coming up to meet my face. Alarm. 6:30 a.m. My bed, my room, June 4th. The hope I'd felt was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy dread that settled deep in my bones. Leaving didn't work. The loop wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to me. And it always ended in death. After the first month, I stopped counting the loops. The deaths grew more varied, more creative. I was electrocuted by a faulty toaster. I choked on a piece of steak. A brain aneurysm. A pulmonary embolism. A gas leak in the house that I only noticed when the air grew thick and sweet and my lungs refused to work. Each death was terrifying, but the reset was worse. Waking up again, unharmed, in the same bed, on the same day, with the full, vivid memory of my own demise, it was a unique form of psychological torture. The isolation was the real poison. I was a ghost in my own life, walking among people who were nothing more than automatons reciting a script. Their conversations, their laughter, their complaints, it was all just noise. A recording played on repeat. I tried to tell them. In one loop, I ran into the office screaming, babbling about the repeating day. They stared at me with placid concern, then called security. That night, the death was swift, a fall down the stairs. My neck snapped. The loop, it seemed, didn't like it when I tried to disturb the timeline. It corrected my behavior with brutal efficiency. So I stopped trying. I moved through the day like a phantom. My interactions minimal, my face a mask of weary indifference. The world had become a stage set, and I was the only conscious actor, condemned to play out the same scene for eternity. The gray, overcast sky of every June 4th became my personal sky. A permanent, oppressive ceiling. The silence of my house at night was no longer just quiet, it was a hungry, waiting void. I must have been hundreds of loops in when things began to change. The deaths became less accidental, less random. It started subtly. One night, as 11:59 p.m. approached, I was huddled in my basement, reasoning it was the safest place. There were no windows, only one solid door which I had barricaded. The air grew cold, a damp, cellar chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I saw my breath plume in front of me. Then, I heard a sound, a faint drip, drip, drip. I looked up. The ceiling was perfectly dry. The pipes were silent, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the small space. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like it was coming from inside my own head. Panic seized me. I scrambled for the door, fumbling with the barricade. At 11:59 p.m., the floor beneath me simply gave way. Not a collapse of wood and nails, but a sudden, stomach-lurching liquefaction. I plunged not into earth, but into icy, black water that filled my mouth and lungs before I could even scream. I woke up sputtering, coughing up phantom water. June 4th. From then on, there was a presence, a malevolence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It was in the way the shadows in my house seemed to deepen and stretch when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was in the cold spots that would manifest in the middle of a room, raising gooseflesh on my arms. It was in the whispers that started at the edge of my hearing, too faint to be words, but filled with a sibilant, mocking intent. The deaths now carried a signature of deliberate cruelty. One night, every reflective surface in my house, mirrors, windows, the screen of my television, shattered simultaneously at 11:59 p.m. A storm of glass that shredded my skin. Another night, I felt an invisible weight press down on my chest, slowly, methodically, crushing my ribs one by one until my lungs collapsed. I endured immolation, exsanguination, suffocation. The loop was no longer just a prison, it was a torture chamber. And some unseen warden was growing bored with simple accidents. My sanity began to fray. I stopped leaving the house. The outside world was meaningless. My focus narrowed to the four walls of my home and the entity that shared it with me. I spent my days in a state of hyper-vigilant terror, trying to understand my tormentor. Why was this happening? Why June 4th? The date itself felt arbitrary. My birthday was in October. No major life events, no traumas I could recall, had ever happened on this date. I dedicated dozens of loops to a single task: research. I scoured my own digital life, old emails, calendars, social media, nothing. I searched news archives for tragedies that occurred on June 4th. Nothing that connected to me. The date was a blank slate. A meaningless point on the calendar that had somehow become the anchor for my eternal damnation. The house became more active. I would hear footsteps in the attic, slow and heavy, when I knew I was the only one home. Doors would creak open on their own. I'd catch fleeting movements in my peripheral vision, a tall, slender darkness darting just out of sight. One afternoon, while staring blankly out the kitchen window, I saw something that froze my blood. In the reflection on the glass, standing directly behind me, was the silhouette of a man. He was tall and gaunt, his form indistinct, like a figure made of smoke and shadow. I whipped around, my heart seizing. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, but the feeling of his presence, of cold, ancient eyes watching me, lingered for hours. My investigation had to turn inward. If the answer wasn't in the world, it had to be inside me. I began to meditate, forcing my mind back, dredging up memories I had long since buried. It was an agonizing process. Each day, I would sit in the center of my living room floor, close my eyes, and try to relive my life, searching for a key, a forgotten trauma connected to this date. The entity seemed to hate this. The whispers would grow louder, scratching at my concentration. The house would groan and shudder around me. It didn't want me to remember. It was on a loop I can only guess was number 4 or 500 that I finally broke through. I was pushing back, further than I ever had before. Past college, past high school, back into the haze of childhood. The whispers were a roar now. The house shaking as if in an earthquake. I ignored it. I saw fragments. Scraped knees. Bicycle rides. The taste of popsicles in the summer heat. And then I saw a lake. The image was so vivid, so real, that it felt like I was there. Lake Anawanda. The family used to go there every summer. The sun was hot on my skin. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. And I saw him, my younger brother, Leo. He was 8 years old. A skinny kid with a wild mop of brown hair and a gap-toothed smile. He was wading out into the water, chasing a bright red beach ball that was drifting away. I was 14. I was supposed to be watching him. The memory slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't watching him. I was on the shore, hidden behind a cluster of birch trees, trying to impress a girl named Sarah. We were talking, laughing. I was showing off, full of the stupid, swaggering confidence of a 14-year-old boy. I had forgotten about Leo. I had forgotten everything except the girl in front of me. I remembered the sound, not a scream for help. He was too proud for that. It was a single, sharp splash, louder than it should have been. It cut through my teenage fog. I turned. The red beach ball was floating serenely on the surface of the water. But Leo was gone. The panic, the frantic, screaming search, my parents' faces, crumbling into a despair so absolute it haunted my nightmares for years. The divers, the grim discovery hours later, the funeral, the endless, suffocating guilt that I had buried so deep, encasing it in years of denial and willful forgetting, that I had almost convinced myself it wasn't my fault. And the date, I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I searched my own family history, my own name. An old local news article popped up. Local boy drowns in tragic accident. The date of publication, June 5th. The article stated the drowning occurred late in the afternoon on June 4th. The room went silent. The shaking stopped. The whispers ceased. The oppressive presence in the house pulled back, as if holding its breath, waiting. I finally understood. This wasn't a random curse. This wasn't hell. It was penance. My own mind, my own guilt, had created this prison, a loop of the day I let my brother die, ending each time in a death as sudden and unfair as his. But that theory, as neat as it was, didn't account for the malevolence. My guilt was a feeling, a weight. It wasn't the shadowy figure I saw in the reflection. It wasn't the entity that took pleasure in devising new ways for me to die. My guilt had created the cage. Yes, but something else had moved in. That night, I did not hide. I did not cower in the basement or barricade myself in a room. I walked calmly into the bathroom and began to fill the tub with cold water. I would face this, I would end this loop by reenacting not my death, but his. I would accept my guilt, drown in it, and maybe, just maybe, I would not wake up. The water rose, cold and clear. I took off my shirt and sat on the edge of the tub. The porcelain cold against my skin. The house remained utterly still. The silence was heavier than any noise it had ever made. I looked at the clock on my phone, 11:57 p.m. It was time. As I moved to lower myself into the water, a sound came from the hallway. A soft, wet footstep, then another. It was the sound of someone, soaking wet, walking slowly towards the bathroom. My blood ran cold. I was frozen, my gaze locked on the open doorway. A figure emerged from the darkness of the hall and stepped into the dim light of the bathroom. It was not the tall, slender shadow I had glimpsed before. It was a boy, a small, skinny boy, no older than 8. His hair was a matted, dripping mess. His skin was pale blue, wrinkled and waterlogged. His eyes were wide, empty sockets, dark and fathomless. Water streamed from his clothes, pooling at his feet on the tile floor. He stood there, shivering, his head cocked to one side. It was Leo, but it wasn't him. It was a nightmare wearing his face. He opened his mouth, and a torrent of murky lake water and silt poured out onto the floor. A sound came from his throat, not a voice, but a gurgling, watery hiss that scraped at the inside of my skull. It was a sound of immense suffering, and of an even greater hatred. My theory was wrong, so horribly, cosmically wrong. My guilt hadn't created the loop. My guilt had been an invitation, a broadcast. It was a beacon of despair that had called out into some unknown, dark place, and something had answered, something that had been drawn to my pain, that had latched onto the memory of my brother, and had been feeding on my soul day after day, death after death. This thing wasn't here to make me repent. It was here to play. The thing that looked like my brother took another wet, slapping step into the room. It raised a small, wrinkled hand and pointed a finger at me. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide into a silent, gurgling scream. The clock on my phone, sitting on the sink, ticked over. 11:59 p.m. I didn't drown. The being didn't touch me. Instead, the water in the tub began to bubble, not with heat, but with a frigid, black energy. Dozens of small, pale hands, the hands of children, erupted from the surface. They were all around me, their grip like iron, their touch a deathly cold that burned. They grabbed my legs, my arms, my torso, pulling me down, not into the water of the tub, but into something else. The tub was no longer a tub, it was a gateway. An abyss of black, freezing water that stretched into infinity. As I was dragged under, the last thing I saw was the thing with my brother's face. It was leaning over the edge of the tub, its empty sockets staring down at me, and for the first time, it made a sound that resembled a word, a wet, gurgling whisper that was the most horrifying thing I had ever heard. Again, and then, the blare of my alarm clock. 6:30 a.m. I was in my bed, dry, unharmed. My heart was a frantic, wild thing, trying to escape my chest. I sat up, the phantom cold of the abyss still clinging to my skin. The terror was a living thing inside me now. It had a face. It had a name. I looked at the clock. I looked at the familiar gray sky. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. Before, I was a prisoner, desperately searching for an escape. Now I knew, there is no escape. The cage was never the point. The point is the torment. And my tormentor, the thing wearing my brother's skin, now knows that I know. The game has changed. It's no longer about a random death at 11:59. It's about what it can do to me in the hours leading up to it. The sun has not yet risen, but I can already feel it. The cold spot in the corner of the room. I can hear it, a faint, wet sound from the hallway. Drip, drip, drip. It's going to be a long day, and it will never, ever end.